Welcome back to Crossover Week on Professor Thorgi, and we've got another top 10 list of our favorite crossovers, and this time we're turning our attention to comic books. Crossovers have been more popular in comics than in almost any other medium, and for good reason. As soon as there were two superheroes on the newsstands, all anyone wanted to see was them fighting. And the more comics that came out, the more fights and team-ups occurred between them. So today, we're counting down our top 10 favorite crossovers. But before we begin, just to clarify what I mean by a crossover. For this list, a crossover has to be involving characters from different publishers or properties. In other words, Spider-Man teaming up with Wolverine doesn't count as a crossover. But Spider-Man teaming up with Batman, that's a crossover. Also, just because we're talking about comic books doesn't mean that we're talking solely about comic book characters. This is a list of crossovers that happen within comics, meaning some of them will feature characters that originated from movies, video games, and more. Now, to start us off, at number 10, Spider-Man vs. Superman. This one is kind of poetic that it's at number 10 because this was the crossover that started it all. This was the first official crossover between Marvel and DC, bringing the two most popular heroes from both of their companies together for the first time. What this crossover did was unheard of at the time, and it opened up a whole new world of possibilities between the two companies, and believe me, you'll be seeing much more from the two of them later on this list. Plus, it was the first time that two comic book companies came together to indisputably answer the question from fans, who would win in a fight? It was Superman. But that should be kind of obvious. Number 9, The Invincible War. Now I know what everyone is about to say, hey, you said no crossovers within the same company, and yes, that's true. However, with Image Comics, this is a unique situation. Because at Image, every creator owns their own character, meaning that they can do whatever they want with them, and if you want to use them, then you need their permission. So even though they're all published under Image, they're still treated as completely separate entities. But when Robert Kirkman's character Invincible was attacked by an army of evil alternate universe versions of himself, he knew that this was a threat too big for any one hero. So he went to each of these creators and got the right to do something no one had done before with all these characters. He brought them all together for one massive crossover. And this didn't take dozens of issues of build-up or countless miniseries tie-ins. No, this all happened in just one issue. And yet, even though every character only got a panel or two to shine, that's exactly what happened. Each of them got their chance in the spotlight, and it balanced incredibly well. So for that, and the fact that he actually created a merged Image Comics universe, we salute you, Robert Kirkman. Now if you really want a challenge, try it again with all the new Image characters. You think merging Savage Dragon and Witchblade was hard? Try merging Walking Dead and Sex Criminals. Number 8. Aliens vs. Predator. Ever since these two popped up on the screen, people wanted to see them fight, and we've gotten that successfully in the video games, and less successfully in the movies themselves. But it was in the comics where these two had their first encounter. This crossover was a massive, brutal battle between both sides, and it also introduced us to Machiko Noguchi, a human predator, which is just a really cool thing to say. But the main reason that it makes it onto this list is because, as I said, these were two movie properties and they fought for the first time in comics. Because since comics are so much cheaper to make, movie studios realized, hey, we can go nuts here and not have to worry about losing a ton of money. So for opening the door between movies and comics just that much more, I salute this book with a spot on this list. Now, before we reveal number 7, a little backstory. About 10 years ago, Marvel created a brand new universe where a zombie virus overtook the entire Earth and everyone with superpowers turned into Marvel zombies. These superpowered zombies overran their world until they were the last ones left, and then they departed for universes unknown. This Marvel Zombie series was incredibly popular, and it was even written by the creator of The Walking Dead, Robert Kirkman, who you might remember from previously in this episode. Now, after the first Marvel Zombie series, they promised that the next series would be the prequel. It would tell the story of how all these heroes were infected, of how this world fell, and of the one man who was willing to stand against them, and that man was John Cena! Oh, come on, guys! That joke's not even funny anymore. Okay, I guess it's a little bit funny. But no! The real person I'm talking about is... Number 7, Marvel Zombies vs. Army of Darkness. Yes, I am not making this up. The origin of the Marvel Zombies, a franchise that went on for years, involved Ashley Williams from the films Evil Dead and Army of Darkness being sucked into this alternate Marvel universe right as the first hero was infected and he had to find a way home. This makes the list for 2 reasons. One is because it embraced just how crazy the idea of a crossover can be, but also because most crossovers are one-shots that never affect anything, so that way they never have to bring it up again, and since they don't own the rights to it. But this is what's so crazy about this crossover. It's canon! This is the actual origin of the Marvel Zombies world, and Ash was there for all of it. To this day, I still can't believe this happened, and I loved every crazy minute of it. When I was a teenager and I was a fan of Marvel Comics and of horror films, I never one day thought that Ash would be pointing a boomstick at Spider-Man, but there we go. It happened. Alright, let's go to something a little lighter after that for number 6, which is Mega Man and Sonic Worlds Unite. Mega Man and Sonic had already crossed over in the comics, and that was indeed a pretty historic thing on its own, so for their second crossover, they needed to go bigger, and boy did they. For this second crossover, they didn't just jump into each other's dimensions, but into the alternate worlds of all the Sega and Capcom franchises they could afford. This wasn't just a crossover between Sonic and Mega Man, it was between Street Fighter, Beautiful Joe, Monster Hunter, Skies of Arcadia, Breath of Fire, Billy Hatcher, Okami, Alex Kidd, Knights, and so many more! This might be the biggest crossover between various franchises I've seen in comics, and sure, everyone had to keep their appearances short, but even if their appearances were limited in quantity, they made up for it with tons of quality. Each character got a chance to shine in their own world, where they showed off their skills and personal stories, and when they finally met up, we got one full issue with some of the craziest combinations fans could dream of. It was an entire issue of just pure crossover fan service. And as you read it, you really get a sense that the people behind this crossover weren't just handed a bunch of characters, but that they actually knew and understood each of them. If you're a gamer who longs to see some of these characters return, this will scratch that itch just fine. Although seriously, Sega, give us another Skies of Arcadia. I'm begging you here, just do it. Number 5, Crisis of Infinite Earths. Okay, again, I know someone is going to speak up and say, hey, you said the crossovers had to be from different publishers, and that is true. And indeed, this crossover only involved DC characters. However, a little backstory. Characters such as Blue Beetle and Captain Marvel didn't originally come from DC. Several of their most popular characters came from Charlton and Fawcett Comics and were acquired by DC over the years. However, even when DC acquired these characters, they kept them in their own universe separate from the main heroes as a way of treating them like they were still published by a separate division. However, that all came to an end during the Crisis of Infinite Earths, when DC Comics destroyed their multiverse, bringing together the heroes of every one of their separate realities to fight the Anti-Monitor, and in the end, there was only one Earth left standing, and the heroes of all these separate universes merged together in both worlds and backstory. So yes, I will admit that at this point DC already owned all these characters, but they were still being treated as completely separate properties, and this crossover was the final step to taking these characters from separate companies, many of which were heavy competitors to DC, and making them official DC characters. It's rare that a crossover has a lasting effect, and this shaped the entire future of the DC universe. Number 4, Robocop vs. Terminator. Just like Alien vs. Predators, this was a team-up fans have been wanting to see for years. A robotic hero from the future, robotic villain from the future, seemed like a natural fit. But what made this even greater was that it was actually written by Frank Miller, who, sure, today is a crazy man, but back then he was the biggest name in comics, and 2 years before this crossover, he even wrote Robocop 2. So in other words, this is a comic book crossover featuring 2 movie characters actually written by one of the writers of the actual movies. And the idea behind it was brilliant. It merged the 2 worlds in a genius way, saying that in Robocop's reality, he actually was the early version of Skynet, and that what became Skynet, the evil computer system that would take over the world, learned to think from Robocop himself. This adventure sent our cybernetic hero into the future and back to try and free mankind, and then wraps it all up in a way that actually could make it canon. This crossover cut the two properties together with the grace of a surgeon, and handled them with way more respect than, let's say, the people in charge of the franchises now. Number 3, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I almost didn't count this one because it wasn't really a crossover event like the other crossovers on this list, but an actual series. However, when you look at what was accomplished in this book, how could you not consider it a crossover? Heck, when you think about what this comic actually is, it's one of the biggest, craziest crossovers I've ever seen. Famed comic book writer and outspoken crazy hermit Alan Moore took dozens upon dozens of classic literary characters, everything from Alan Quatermain to Mr. Hyde to Captain Nemo, and had them team up to take down Sherlock Holmes' greatest enemy, Professor Moriarty. And it didn't end there. There were countless classic literary Easter eggs sprinkled all over every page, and several sequels that featured characters from novels all throughout time. Not only was this crossover something no one had ever thought of, but it also merged all of these characters' stories and personalities in a way that captured each of their respective tones perfectly and made it feel like one genuine team-up between these separate worlds. At least in the first couple of stories it did. Towards the end, it went full-on bat poop crazy. What is it with great crossovers driving their creators insane? Someone look into that. And for God's sake, someone warn Robert Kirkman! Number 2, DC vs. Marvel. There had been several crossovers between Marvel and DC before this event, however most of them started off with heroes fight, realize it's a misunderstanding, then team up and fight the bad guy. But if you go into any comic shop, any forum or website, or listen to any podcast or video about comics, you don't see people asking, hey, what would happen if these characters teamed up? No. There is one simple question that has defined geeks since the dawn of comics. Who would win in a fight? And this crossover finally gave the fans what they wanted, as both universes collided and decided that only one could survive. So they had 11 champions go up against each other to decide who was strongest, and that led to some amazing fights, including Thor and Shazam, Green Lantern and Silver Surfer, and Aquaman vs. Namor. But in the end, the final 5 fights were decided by the fans. That's right. You, the audience, got to vote on the final 5 winners to decide which company would win once and for all. But it didn't end there. At the end, the two universes complemented each other, almost as if both companies were giving respectful nods to one another, and then did one of the craziest things I've ever seen in comics. They merged together for a month of new comics from a publisher called Amalgam, where the heroes and villains from each universe were merged into a new reality. I've often said that crossovers are just there to please the fans, and this was an event that tickled the imagination of fans all across the world. But not only was this not the best crossover of all time, it wasn't even the best Marvel and DC crossover, because that leads me to number 1, JLA Avengers. Not only was this filled with as many cameos and crazy crossovers as the DC vs. Marvel event, but the DC vs. Marvel event was more of just pure fan appreciation. Everyone got to vote on the winners, and there was little to no rhyme or reason behind anything happening. It was just for fun, so who cares? But with the JLA Avengers crossover, Kurt Busiek, who is a longtime writer on the Avengers and had close ties to DC Comics with his own properties, knew these characters inside and out and spent literally years crafting this story together so that it wasn't just pure fun, but also a legitimately great story. He didn't just capture the tone of the two teams perfectly, he also really deconstructed what made each world what they were and what the real difference between each company was. When the JLA went to the Avengers world, they saw how much crime and corruption existed, and they realized the Avengers must be villains. And when the Avengers went to the JLA world and saw how peaceful and perfect it was, they assumed that they must rule their planet with an iron fist. From there, the two teams had to race to collect the most powerful items from each of their worlds before the mad god Krona could obtain them. All throughout this, the teams clashed with each other and answered many of fans' greatest questions. Who is stronger, Superman or Thor? Could Captain America actually beat Batman? Who's faster, Quicksilver or the Flash? All this led to a climactic battle where time and space were being destroyed, so every single version of both teams throughout history were brought together to save the day. Not only was this truly a great story, but it also hit all the geeky fantasies its readers wanted to see. When you have Superman holding Thor's hammer and Cap's shield shouting "Avengers Assemble," well, that's just everything every comic fan has wanted to see since they were 5 years old. And it's because of all that this will indeed live on as the greatest crossover comic story of all time. Thanks for watching, everyone, and remember, it's crossover week here on my channel, so if you enjoyed this video, then hit subscribe so you can see all the rest that I have planned this week. Also, I'd sure appreciate it if you guys left a thumb up down there and shared this video across the web. And as always, I want to hear from you guys. Let me know what your favorite comic book crossover is in the comments down below. Thanks again, and come back later this week for more crossover goodness.